It's the most stressful thing I do in my career.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, the most successful, the most beloved thing I do.
Yeah.
But it's not really my nature. It's my nature to push boundaries and bite the hand that feeds me, quote unquote. But for me, physically, to be confrontational, that is not me at all. Even when I do triumph, I almost always try to ask the person in advance, is it okay if you talk to my puppet here?
But you couldn't always do that with some, especially with some of the political people. It's not so easy to do. You just kind of have to go for it.
No, you have no choice. You have no choice when you're in the middle of like, oh my God, it's so stressful to go to these debates.
Yeah.
And then you're in the spin room afterward and
I've been
everybody's
there
taking
too. It's crazy.
Yeah, and everybody's taking it really seriously. And also when I did these Hulu specials in 2016, and I would go to a town hall and John Kasich would be speaking, and it would be so easy for me to yell something and get a big laugh, but I just couldn't bring myself to do it.
Really?
I just felt like I'm not going to be that guy who makes it that much about him and his character. I want to be respectful of the process to that degree. I don't want to. A lot of people work hard at this, and contrary to what goes out, there are a lot of people who are sincerely believe they're doing it for the right reasons. There are plenty of opportunists, plenty of scumbags out there too, but there are people who support candidates and work on campaigns for other reasons, for purer reasons. And I just don't feel right about being that level of disruptive. Plus, there's an extra layer of irony because Triumph's got a bow tie and a cigar, and his rhythm is very Catskills old school. Even though we try to write really funny jokes, the fact that Triumph adheres to this dinosaur kind of conceit sort of lowers his status even more. You know, so it becomes kind of like the jester and the kind of thing where, you know, you can make jokes in front of the king and the king's not going to be offended. Like a good example. So the Star Wars fans, a friend of mine suggested I do that. He had an office outside the Ziegfeld Theater and he told me about the line. I proposed it and they told me, oh, we pitched that. We actually thought of doing that for Conan. And then they said, we'll talk to Conan about it. And Conan inherently understood exactly what I just articulated, that it would come off way funnier and less mean to have the puppet doing it than for Conan to be out there making fun of the nerds.
Yeah.
And so he had the right instinct. So he gave up that one and said, yeah, no, send Triumph. And of course, that's the one I hear about more than any to this day and always will, probably. And that's fine.
Yeah.
I don't need to top it. There'd be really no reason to write the ambiguously gay duo.
Yeah. You were working on a movie for a while, right? Or you were developing
I did.
a movie?
I wrote a movie with Colbert in the year 2005. It was for Jim Carrey.
Oh, wow.
And yeah.
He was going to play the villain, or he was going
to play Ace. Colbert and I, because Colbert, of all the people who would help me write, different people helped me write different cartoons. Colbert was my main guy who helped me with Ace and Gary.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he had a great ear, especially for those kind of double entendre lines that Ace and Gary would say. Just a great ear for it.
Yeah, and I feel like a lot of people still don't know that it was him and Steve Carell doing the voices all that time.
That's right.
On SNL.
That's right, because it was the first thing they did for the Dana Carvey show when Steve had just Colbert had just gotten off a plane and went straight to a recording studio. And I made him Ace and Colbert the sidekick Gary. Yeah, so Jim Carrey met with us. We wrote a script, and then we waited literally a year for an answer, and we got back that his managers were split. One of them was like, this is great, and the other one was like, you're never going to be Tom Hanks if you do this. You're 40 years old. And so he didn't do it. And then a couple of years later, he did Dumb and Dumberer.
Yeah. You were at SNL for such a long time. Why did you end up leaving? What was the sort of catalyst to move on from SNL? I was asked to leave,
finally.
Yeah.
I mean, listen, I got to write there for 8 years. Then I took a few years off doing other things, writing movies, and then the Dana Carvey show. And then I went back when I had the cartoon idea. I got to do the cartoons for 11 years there. So now we're into like 2008 by now. And I had started there in 1985.
It's wild.
And, so as 8 years and then 2 off and then 11 years with cartoons. And it was not pretty the way it ended. I got to be honest. Yeah, because, and I talked about it in the SNL book, and it wasn't Lauren at all. He was very gracious they took advantage of, first of all, it was an era where the show was not, I thought it had an amazing cast at the time, actually, one of their, maybe their best cast ever, but I don't think the network, it really wasn't until Sarah Palin that the show took off to the next level.
Yeah. And really hasn't been the same since, I think.
Well, it's been more relevant ever since than it was before then.
Not necessarily a bad way. I just mean that changed it, I think, in terms of the celebrity cameos and the.
Yes. That's subjective. But in terms of its relevance, its seeming relevance, it took it to another level. The first thing that did was the Lonely Island videos, kind of, and that sort of pushed the show in a whole much better direction, I think. But this is like right before that. This is like 2007. In 2007, they fired like 4 great cast members. They fired Rachel Dratch and Horatio and Parnell, and I believe somebody else. And it felt like I barely got by. Like my cartoons had gotten pretty expensive, partly because I was giving the animators raises and also because I was doing them faster than ever because I wanted them to be more topical.
Yeah.
Partly, like I always approached the show like, what does the show need? Even though I had a lot of freedom with the cartoons, like once Will Ferrell left and they didn't have a Bush they were totally confident in, I started doing more political pointed cartoons about the administration because I felt the show needed to. I felt like, we were being a little tame. And so.
Yeah. And they never quite figured out Obama, I don't think so.
Yeah. They got a lot of crap for having Armisen do it. And then Jay Farrow got to do it, but they didn't they never got a handle on writing for Obama. Really.
Yeah.
So then, this is now, those 3 guys get dumped because the show is not a gigantic, again, it's pre-Sarah Palin.
Yeah.
And so they're looking to cut budget. And then the next year, the writer's strike hits and everything is stopped for a while. And then I'm told that they're not going to renew you. Every SNL contract has a formal thing in it where, at least it used to be all the years I was there, where they had an option to renew you like in December or New Year's, right around then for the second half of the season. And it was always a formality. But this one year, because of the writer's strike, I know that Jeff Zucker in particular and the NBC in general were looking to get rid of a lot of fat in their minds.
Yeah, they kind of took advantage of the writer's strike.
Yes, and trimmed a lot of fat in what they considered fat. And so I was told I wasn't going to be renewed. And Lauren didn't, he didn't have enough power. He didn't have enough juice to fight for it. And I really, it really bothered me because I just didn't think that was appropriate to let someone go. Been there for some 23 years.
Yeah. Worked
very hard, done a lot of good stuff for the show. Here they're just basically cutting off an income that I had planned for that year. And and Lauren went back and fought to get me one cartoon. I got to do one cartoon like when we came back in February, and that was it. And then I was gone. Fortunately, I had written the Zohan movie. And the Zohan movie came out in 2008 and it made a lot of money. And then I just sort of shifted into movies and started writing more movies, mostly with Adam, but other movies too. Not that they got made, but I made some good deals and I was able to make a living doing that. But that happened. And then within the same year, Conan moved to Los Angeles. So the 2 gigs that I had basically counted on as my foundation, financially and creatively, were gone because I had made an overall deal. Yeah, I made an overall deal with Conan's people to do the Clutch Cargos and to do Triumphs and was making a decent salary. So it was tough. And then it was just so funny because then I'm gone and the first show, fall 2008, cold opening is Tina Fey as Sarah Palin. And the show that I'd always dreamed of being a part of, even though I loved the show, but I always wanted that for Lauren. And for myself too, to be a part of the show when everybody's talking about it.
Right.
Because I grew up on the show and I had an amazing time doing the show, but it was never like it was in the 70s. And it was close. There were some moments where we did some great things.
Yeah.
Dana's George Bush and Ross Perot. We got up there, but it wasn't like that. It was almost like I'd stepped away from 30 Rock and fireworks went off. It was almost like a bad joke on me. but that's okay. I was very happy for Lauren, really happy for him, because he never talked as if the show wasn't in the center of everyone's conversation.
Well, in a way, it always was, but then it really was.
Yeah, but then it really, really was.
Do you still watch the show?
I watch the show a fair amount. I don't watch it a lot. I'm an old man, and I have 2 sons at home and the older boy, and it's hard to stay up. Yeah. It's hard to be up at 11:30 on a Saturday night. So I try to catch, more often than not, I try to catch the sketches on YouTube the next day or on Monday when the kids are in school. I try to catch, I do follow the show and try to catch as much of it as I can.
I mean, your satire, as I said, has always been really hard hitting. What do you make of the way that the show has handled Trump?
I think it's been up and down. It's a hard one. I think it's been hard for everybody in a way, because he's such a sitting duck. Something I mentioned in a tweet a few weeks ago was I feel like even during this terrible time, everything was focused on Trump. And like when the riots started, like for weeks, I felt like all the late night shows were still just making it all about Trump. This problem has existed long before Donald Trump. And I'm not giving Trump any kind of free pass by any stretch of the imagination. But my problem was that I know he's easy to make fun of. I know why he's easy to make fun of. I do it as much as anybody when I'm doing Triumph. But if you've got a platform and all you're going to make fun of is Donald Trump.
We briefly touched on the Dana Carvey show, but I wanted to talk about that. What kind of stands out for you from that whole experience?
I don't have happy memories of that time.
Yeah.
It was a very, very, like Conan, for some reason, the first year, it was a little like the first year of Conan, which was very, we were in danger of being canceled constantly. Like we were getting 13-week renewals, and that's it, literally for the first year. But I have wonderful memories of that one, because somehow we were, even though we were, hated by the network on some level and in danger, we were kind of left alone creatively. And we felt like this new group of people who were all connecting. Like I had just hired Louis and Dino and Andy Richter, and we were all on the same wavelength with me and Conan. And it was the most exciting gig ever to create that show out of nowhere and try to make it original and funny. And we did so many crazy bits that a number of them fell flat in a hilarious way, but many of them, he did for years and years, even from the first week. And it was just such a satisfying thing. Whereas the Dana Carvey show, we had network involvement creatively all the time. And we made an incredibly bad decision on the very first show. Like the first Conan show was actually a big success.
Yeah.
It was only after that once the excitement wore off, that people said, oh, he seems nervous. That's one of the things I love about, the silliest stuff I got to do after Saturday Night Live when I was, starting Conan. One of the things that gave me such joy was that I was sort of set free from the sketch parameters, and we could just write the stupidest, purest stuff that, spoke to me.
When they launched Conan, you're the head writer. What are your hours like? Are you doing 12, 14 hours a day more?
Yes. I probably around 14, I would say.
So you're doing 14.
I would say I would come in at around 10, and there would be a morning meeting, and then we would get to work on that show, on future shows, because, talk shows now, they do 4 days a week, but the Conan show was 5 days a week. And that is an enormous difference.
And you guys were doing ambitious things. I mean, it was beyond them.
But we were like, 5 days a week means one more hour of shows to fill and one less day to just focus on material and not production. And so it made it much harder. And they, about 3 years in, I think that schedule changed. But yes, so we were there. I would come in at around 10. And if I was lucky, I would leave at 10, but
This is my point. You had just gotten married to Michelle. You're working these crazy hours, but yet you are still writing sketches and submitting on top of that to Saturday Night Live.
Occasionally I would do that. I have an SNL database so that I got from somebody who was working on a Jim Downey documentary that may or may not come out, but
I hope I've heard about it. I hope it comes out, but you should look that up. My point is you're working these in crazy hours, and I thought for sure that Lorne Michaels asked you to come back to write because they were having a really tough year. They had lost everybody. You, the Turners, Christine Zander. They had lost Jack Handy. It was like the power players. So I thought Lauren asked you to come back, but that's not true.
No, nobody asked me for anything. I just, when I had an idea, I missed working there on some level. When I likened it to a gambling addiction
That's what you told me once. You said I was like a gambling addict is what you told me.
Yeah. Well, I remember watching the first show that I wasn't there for, which was Charles Barkley. And ironically, I had a sketch on it.
Which one?
Oh, I think it was called Is That a Guy or something? It was a game
Yeah,
show.
I remember that. Is that RuPaul?
I don't even remember. But it was like a thing that like you could never do now. But back then, people just casually would be like, that's a dude. That we just made it a game show with crude panelists. But yeah, I had, if I still had ideas, I couldn't resist writing them up and them out and putting them on the show. Damon Wayans' show, I had like 2 sketches on. I always watched the sketches live because, and it always mystified me that the writers of sketches would just convene in the writer's room upstairs and watch the show on TV. Like for me, maybe because I just loved the job so much, maybe because I was a sociopath, one or the other, but I hated sitting in the room and just kind of Greek chorusing the show that way. When I had a sketch on Saturday Night Live, I always wanted to be in 8H to watch it live, right past the cameras, because it's like I always felt like this is the only time I'll ever get to see it this way. I can watch it on TV for the rest of my life.
Did you ever have more adrenaline as a writer watching something from the floor than when you did that Steve Martin cold open, the Broadway number with the song?
No, that's amazing that you would pick that one out. Were you there for that one too?
I wasn't there. I had dress rehearsal tickets for me to see this show the first time, and I got appendicitis the day of.
Talk about jumping up and down. That's the one that I remember jumping up and down about.
That's what I was going to say. The best cold open I've ever seen.
That's nice. Well, I did feel like a 10-year-old watching it and every beat working. And, that sketch, I still get emotional when I watch that sketch.
Younger people cannot believe that they would do a cold open without politics. And I want to point out that Steve Martin, James Taylor show had no topical stuff, no politics, which I really miss that they can't get to a show now.
No, that's just late night comedy.
I guess things have changed, but my point is that you guys would have entire shows that weren't topical, which was wouldn't happen a lot. But I wanted to ask for that sketch, that Steve Martin cold open, did you pitch it on Monday? Did you know it had to be the cold open?
That sketch was an idea I had when we were doing Happy Happy Good Show in 1988, but it didn't quite work for that show. And then Steve Martin just showed up and I was like, wait, this is the guy. This is the guy for this idea to sing passionately about how he's actually going to make an effort tonight. And so that's when I started writing it. And in fairness, I want to make sure, because it is one of my favorite things I've ever written, but it was my idea, but Zander helped, Franken and Davis helped. And I believe there might've been more.
The Turners had one beat, I believe.
Probably. I don't. Yeah, this is turning into the William Shatner Star Trek sketch.
I know. That's what
telling me about a horse I own that just had a foal.
That's what Kevin Nealon, the last time I saw him, he said that, you know who you remind me of.
Yeah, myself in the Star Trek sketch. Yeah, that sketch peaked at the end, actually. Not going to phone it in. When he says live from New York and then he says line. That gets a big laugh, and then that you just get chills seeing them sing It's Saturday Night. And
every single time that happens to me, every single time. All I'm saying is, people, if you've never seen this thing, I watch it at least a couple times a year and chills every time.
I really appreciated fans who appreciated what we were trying to do because we were getting reamed publicly at the time, and the show meant more to me than any job I'd ever had. Not that I'd had that many, but, Conan and I were given this opportunity to create this playground and do the silliest stuff we ever dreamed of doing that would never work on SNL. And we were replacing our hero, David Letterman. And I can't imagine ever getting a job that would mean more to me than that.
I've only met Lorne Michaels a handful of times, and he was telling me this story about how he wanted to open up the set of Conan and put in a window and the moon, and just to open up the set. And he told me your response. And what was it?
All I remember is that we were trying very hard not to make the show look cliched like every other talk show with a backdrop of New York City.
With like Letterman. Yeah.
Letterman. Yeah. I mean, everything. I mean, both Lauren and I wanted to change the name of the show from Late Night to, I wanted to call it Nighty Night. He wanted to call it Night Night, which was better. And, but they had no interest in with their potential franchise. And they, it all made sense. They liked the name Late Night, and it's worked for 30 years since. But I don't remember if I had a specific reaction.
He told me that you said they're going to kill us. They're going to go after us because of Letterman, because of the window.
Oh, I was hilariously paranoid. He's right. I was hilariously paranoid about being perceived as doing anything that Letterman did worse. I for the first year, I always joke that I didn't allow Conan to do remotes as himself because Letterman had mastered it, and I'd seen Dennis Miller try, and I'd seen Pat Sajak try, and it's like, okay, Conan's not these guys. I mean, well, Dennis is pretty damn funny, but I wasn't even interested in giving Conan a chance because I just wanted us to create our own path, just establish something very different. And then maybe later on, then we can start bringing in ideas that are more derivative of other shows. But it was really scary to me to be, because I'd seen like Pat Sajak and Dennis do remotes, and they paled next to Letterman's, and I just didn't want to be put in that position.
I have to say, though, the first one I remember, and I could be off if this was the first, was Andy Richter at Woodstock, which was really, really funny.
Well, this is the thing. So I was like, Andy can go to do remotes, but not you. That was the first thing I was like, let's start sending Andy out, because it'll give Andy something to do. It'll give him more credibility as being your sidekick, because he was getting all the kicked out of him. I would send Andy out with specific premise-oriented sketch ideas that would be remotes. Like, so the first one was he went to the Grammy Awards, and all you care about, Andy, is that Finn
I remember,
has never been inducted into, has never received a Grammy, and all you want to do. So they were like obsession pieces. And then Conan did his first remote that was kind of a Conan remote in the September of 94 when he went to Sun Studios in Memphis. And so there was a premise to that where he wanted to be a country star. So there was still like, we were doing what we were doing with Andy with Conan now. We were like creating premise.
Is that the one that Sting made a cameo on, or was that a different?
No, that was
a different one.
That was a premise remote that we would have him do scripted remotes. Even from the beginning, he did like scripted remotes, and not that premise was, not that was entirely scripted, but it was mostly scripted. It was like a Curb Your Enthusiasm, like every scene was kind of planned out and they would improvise off of that. So that was Conan wanting to do a We Are the World kind of song called Famous Helping People was called. And, so it was him and Andy and, Oldie Olson, who we'd already established in another remote that was where during the baseball strike, I wanted players to, I wanted to substitute baseball with games, which were, we had like 6-year-olds playing 80-year-old men, and which was surprisingly competitive. And so that's where Carl Oldie Olson was created. And then we brought him back many, many times, but the first time was during this famous Helping People sketch. Sting was kind enough to do a cameo in at the very end.
Conan had sang on the show, like the first show, but not a lot.
Right.
That brings me to my next thing, which is that besides Letterman coming on the show in December of 94, he premiered in September.
Yes.
That, and other than the college audiences coming that summer, I think that those probably saved the show. But I would argue that the next factor after that was Conan changing the warm-up.
Conan changing the warm-up. Starting that summer, the audiences were just more excited in general, and that was because college kids were home and were able to travel to New York. And actually, so the audience was filled with fans as opposed to people who were just there to, because they couldn't get into Letterman. And they wanted to see it. They wanted to see a real talk show. So, I mean, not that we didn't have fans, because you could tell just from watching, if you watch early shows, you could tell that like recurring bits like Clinton on Clutch Cargo would get anticipatory applause from the beginning. So there were people who were fans watching our show in the audience, but that summer it grew exponentially because college kids were.
One of the most interesting things I remember is Joel Goddard. They gave him the warm-up because Conan had no real experience, and they were afraid that any warm-up comic might be funnier than when Conan came out. So they get rid of Joel. And then at least one time before Sweeney came in, I saw Louis C.K., unknown, do the warm-up, and he's purposely not being funny. It was so strange to watch because to me, it was clearly he doesn't want to outshine Conan. And I'm like, it was just such a strange thing because I've seen that guy kill when in stand-up clubs where there was like no energy in the audience, and he was always able to bring it up. But I thought that was an interesting choice, and he didn't do it much, I don't think.
That was something when it came to behind the scenes and how the show works. We were trying to copy Letterman. I believe Letterman had Bill Wendell do the warm-up. All those years, not when he moved to CBS, he had Eddie Brill, a comedian, do it.
Bill Sheff did it for a while on that last couple of years of late night and early CBS.
Bill Sheff, yeah. But in the 80s and early 90s on NBC, I'm pretty sure my memory serves me right that Bill Wendell, the announcer, was the guy doing.
Yeah, Wendell did almost all of it, and that's why you did it with Joel. October 23rd, 1999, Norm Macdonald hosts Saturday Night Live. Backstage, you were with Sandler. Norm brought in a couple of writers, including Fred Wolf, Sam Simon, Andy Breckman. What was it like backstage? Because the monologue, Lorne didn't want him to do the monologue. Did you contribute to any of Norm's pieces? And what was the energy like?
I was brought in to give Norm advice on the monologue. I mean, just by Norm. And two things that stick out that I remember. I don't remember writing any of it offhand, but I do remember thinking that joke was really funny, the one that everybody got angry about, which was that, why are they having me back if I wasn't funny? And, it must be because now the show's really bad, so I'm funny in comparison. I think that was the crux of the joke. And, I thought it was really funny. I certainly didn't discourage him from doing it. But Norm went out there. There were a couple of people, I'm not going to mention them, that were very upset by that joke.
The writers. There were writers out there that booed him. There were like about 3 or 4. I don't know who it was. Writers who did that. I never heard who did it. I can tell you at least one person that it was. No, there were people that were really upset. I mean,
Can you name the name?
You guys would always make fun of the show back in the 80s and early 90s.
Relentlessly, we would make fun of the show. We would even, look, I wrote the cliffhanger sketch in 1986 as a young novice. And I always felt like if the show's having any kind of, if there's any issue that's an elephant in the room, you might as well go for it. And in this case, the elephant in the room was that Norm was fired in a really awkward manner. And he had every right to come back and throw a dig at the show just for sport. I mean, it was crazy when you think about it. And it wasn't like, everybody was upset and hurt, and like nobody was remembering, like, think about what happened to Norm. I mean, to be displaced in the middle of a season and like, and having to stay on the show and watch someone else take his place. The only thing he wanted to do on the show was Weekend Update. And here everybody was so sensitive about just a gentle poke that was coming from Norm Macdonald of all people. So you got to take it with a grain of salt anyway.
You could feel that tension backstage a little bit.
No, one writer came up to me and said, "Thanks a lot."
I can't believe that they had that reaction.
Another writer openly, yelled at me like, why would you encourage him to do that joke? And I was like,
I want to mention two things. One, Andy Breckman, who they brought over, who worked on, I believe, some of the monologue. He was over there. He was a guest writer all the time. And after the Norm episode, he was never asked to come back again. And he wrote some really famous pieces. So it was a big...
I don't remember that. But Andy, well, there was a weird... Andy talked about it in the SNL book that there was this weird tension that he felt when he went back to the show once Downey was gone and there was a whole new bunch of people there. And we all felt it a little bit. There were certain people who were always super encouraging about my cartoons, like Amy Poehler and Colin Quinn. But there was, there were some people who Lauren told me openly resented that I had like a guaranteed slot on the show, as he put it. And he was like, and I tell them, you've earned it. But it's not like I was putting on bad shit. At the time, my cartoons were getting, very encouraging comments from the press and from fans. So it was a strange time back then. And I think there was a level of insecurity among that group that, bubbled over on when Norm did that. I also did a cartoon. I did a cartoon that made fun of the show, but made fun of the show and Howard Stern kind of equally when he was like ripping into the Goat Boy sketch. He did a whole thing about, because he competed with us for a year or two unsuccessfully on CBS. And he launched a whole tirade against the show. And I did a cartoon about that. And Lauren was happy with it because he said it made as much fun of Howard Stern as it did of the show or whatever. Both sides were, I think Howard was more upset with it than the show was.
A Saturday Night Live writer told me this story. This is TV Funhouse. This is March 25th of 2003. Selma Hayek is hosting. And the writer, this was the Funhouse. It was Are You Hot? Which was you, Chris Parnell, and Doug Dale doing the voices. And Lorenzo Lamas had this terrible show, a reality type show called Are You Hot? Where he would judge people and have a laser beam type thing where he would like point out people's flaws. So you do this sketch.
Yeah. And so we were doing it with cartoon characters.
Yeah. Are You Hot? And they would have cartoons.
Sexist and yeah.
So this is what the writer told me. He said after Dress, he went up to you and I mean, it killed. He thought it was like, oh man, that's so funny. Yeah. And then he mentioned that Optimus Prime voice was just a little bit off, but it was great. Not really thinking you would do anything about this. And he told me that you freaked out and you sent, I don't know if it you personally or somebody went down to Kim's video, which is miles away. I mean, there's really to get a tape of Optimus Prime. So is this true? And how much time do you have to make this correction?
I don't remember that at all, but it's possible. It's certainly something I would have done if I could have done it. So
he told me you did.
I did do it. And so the voice was different on air?
Yeah. Did that happen sometimes that you almost up until air that you were still working?
Oh yeah. No, there's one time
on the cartoons. Wow.
Well, there was one disastrous time, and I talk about this in the SNL book, where I did a cartoon about the Christian Coalition Network. I had done this a couple of times as a running thing. And this particular night, it was a series of cartoons. Like there was a cartoon about Darwin being a bumbling idiot, and a cartoon called the Celibots, which were robots that were celibate. And there was a third cartoon called the 700 Gang, and it was Pat Robertson and a bunch of kids, and he was spouting off a lot of nonsensical dogma. And this piece did well. The thing that killed the very hardest was the Pat Robertson group, and they were stuck for a cold open. And Higgins said, why not just take that out of Smigel's piece and make it a cold open? So I was like, okay, I'm going to have to re-edit it and give him a live from New York at Saturday night kind of thing. And so I run back to, and again, I had to go to Sony Studios, which is where we always mixed the show and edited. And so that was on 54th and 10th, and it's Saturday night and there's always traffic. So I bolted down there, got it done, re-edited. I had to re-edit both cartoons, got it done by about 11 o'clock. And as he's laying down the sound, something's wrong. Something crashes. I still don't know exactly what happened, but there was no sound and he had to do it again. And now I'm freaking out. And I run over there literally at like 11:25. I get there, and Ken Among, the supervising producer of the show, on his own, because he knew I was up against it, he had created a version. He had them chop a version on their own with room for someone to say live from New York at Saturday night, live. And that was going to be, and Daryl Hammond was in the booth ready to do it. So I get there finally, and he says, I'm sorry, I got no time to ingest this video. But thank God he had done that. So I run into the booth because I had done the Pat Robertson voice. So to make it consistent, it made sense for me to do it, to say live from New York at Saturday night instead of Daryl. So I run into the booth, and Daryl takes his headphones off and hands them to me. This is halfway through the sketch. And I say live from New York at Saturday night for the first time in my life. Like, writers don't get to say live from New York. This was could have been really fun for me under a normal circumstance. But instead, it was this horrendously panicked moment that we just got through by the skin of our teeth. And I said it, sketch ended, and I walked out of the booth, and I saw Lauren, and I just shook my head like, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry that I caused all this stress, because I could have, yes, the whole thing crashed at 11 o'clock and caused all the disaster, but I could have maybe been a little less picky as I was editing the piece, got it done more like in the 10:30 range.
So he wasn't thrilled with how it went?
No, he was fine with how it went, but it was all this stress that
the behind the scenes stress
didn't need to happen. I felt so bad. I felt so terrible for, because I felt like, I'd almost broken the show. But thank goodness Ken Among had the presence of mind to.
Yeah, he's a really nice man. He supported my other podcast, and we've had lunch and stuff.
He's a comedy geek too, which is a lot of fun. Just loved the show and loves comedy, and is a real student of it. So that always made it, he really supported the writers all the way through
Yeah, he's such a nice guy. I wanted to talk about you and Sandler collaborating, because people know the movies and stuff, but you and him wrote some really funny stuff. Like, my personal favorite that I know that you guys wrote was that French class host. Alec Baldwin was host. And it wasn't until I think after Update, normally the strongest stuff they put first, but that show was jam packed. It was the Chris Farley show with McCartney, but that French class was you and Sandler, right?
Sometimes I don't remember the people I collaborate with. If it was my idea, that was an idea I had based on, I took high school French, and it was just a joke about the way people have strange inflections when they are learning French. And, but I wouldn't surprise me that Adam helped me with it. No doubt about it. He helped me with a lot of sketches. the Pinky Ring sketch and the Joe Pesci show, I'm pretty sure Adam was the only other writer who helped me with that one.
I wanted to ask you about the Joe Pesci show because there are only so many slots for writers. And that Pesci show in particular, I think that they only had like 7 or 8 sketches, and you got 2 of them on. You wrote Pinky Ring, and then you also wrote Bensonhurst's Dating Game with Sandler, I believe.
I think I had 3 on because I think...
Okay, but you get 3 on.
Wasn't there a sketch? The robbers are watching
Crooks?
TV and...
The Crooks. I'm a happy dogger. That was like a commercial.
Yeah, and it was just a play on the trope that every time you turn on the TV, the actual thing you need to see is on right at that moment. So it was a what if. You have to sit through commercials.
How hard was that for you in the office, knowing that you had 3 out of, I think, 9 sketches? There's 9 slots, and you got 3 on. Is that behind the scenes? Do you hear people complaining? I mean, what was that like for you?
The writers were really, I mean, everybody, it was all, you're thrown into a place of competition, which makes the show, harder to deal with emotionally than it would be if it was a calmer scenario where it's not, every show has to be, you always feel like it's do or die because you're only going to have this host for this week. It's not like SCTV where, we can use that sketch anytime. A lot of times stuff is host dependent.
What was your record on getting sketches on for one episode? I mean, that Pesci was 3. Do you know?
I don't know, but I mean, probably like 3 or 4, I guess. I did it multiple times, and the Pesci show was, one of those where I'm not sure. I feel like I know that Pinky Ring and the robbers were my idea. I think Bensonhurst's Dating Game might have been Adams or something.
I thought it was the 2 of you, but I could be off. It was a long time ago.
Definitely wrote it with him. But yeah, I honestly, I feel like there weren't as many writers back then, and we had worked with each other for many years, and we're all friends. And I feel, unless, I felt like it was a much more supportive environment at the time. And
a lot changed over the years. I know I've heard it's really good.
Generation.
Good now.
I remember publicly saying, I would openly saying I would not laugh at read through at other people's sketches, which
he did say that. He did that A&E documentary and was interviewed and said he said that. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was like, I can't imagine not laughing because, like, we all wanted the show to be good, and we were all rooting for sketches to be good. What we would root against was what we perceived as a bad sketch getting into the show. That's what would upset us. If we thought something was either hacky or something was just not going to work, then we would be bummed. But we would never be bummed if a funny sketch got into the show that we didn't write. We'd be excited.
I wanted to ask you, because I heard one of the sketches the writers didn't like because maybe it perceived as hacky was Sweeney Sisters, because there weren't a lot of real jokes. It was more, just the character stuff without the writing, which really didn't happen a lot with you.
I love the Sweeney Sisters.
I mean, they're so funny. I just thought from a writer's standpoint, I wasn't sure. I heard that the writers didn't like that.
I think it's easy to label something as hacky if it's so performance oriented, but those medleys were so carefully crafted and so silly, and you just have to it's one of those, you either like that kind of music and like what they're parodying, or you don't. And if you do, as I did, then you really admire the way they would segue from one to another, and you enjoyed the superciliousness of sanctimoniousness, of Jan Hooks' character. I was a snobby writer in a lot of ways, but I loved performers and I loved watching them be funny, as long as it had some intelligence to it. And I thought that sketch did. The only criticism you could have made about that sketch was that it was, they're ripping off Bill Murray's Lounge Singer, but they took it to a different level because they were doing this medley thing.
It never occurred to me, but I see that now. I was convinced 100% that Steve Martin Holiday Wish sketch, which made the best of Christmas, it was such a Steve Martin. I was convinced Steve wrote it himself because it is so Steve Martin. Then I found out you wrote it.
Well, this is like one of my career highlights because I remember Steve Martin saying it's very rare that I get something written for me that sounds like me that I mean, it was such a thrill. And it was an idea I'd had in Chicago, sort of like Not Gonna Phone It In Tonight. I remember driving on Lakeshore Drive and talking to Michelle and like, what about it? What if if I had one wish? And then I started riffing on it, but I had no place for it. And again, it wasn't until Steve Martin hosted and it happened to be near the holidays. So I went for it. And Bob Odenkirk threw in a great joke. And Steve actually, it did great at read through, but then I got to sit with Steve and he tinkered with it, made the ending funnier. So he ended up writing some of it as well. But yeah, that's absolutely a career highlight.
It's a 5-star.
He's as well,
sketch.
however good it is or not, just the fact that he enjoyed it and it did well, and that it's Steve Martin, who's one of, at the very top of my heroes of comedy.
What was your reaction to that New York Magazine piece by Chris Smith about SNL being a grim joke? This was March of '95, because it was before the internet. It'll be 30 years next year, because internally they were so upset.
I sat with Chris for a long time and I tried to get the point out that, it was a very difficult year. It was a big challenge because they had lost, you started saying that they had lost Handy and me and Xander and the Turners. That's a lot of writers to lose in 1 year when your writing staff is only like 14 people in the first.
I want to interject real quick that Jim Downey said a quote, something like that 90% of our writing, the people that did our writing that got on the show left our show. So, he exaggerated that number a little bit, but it was
a little high, but it was definitely a large amount. And then they'd also lost Dana Carvey. We lost him for the very last half of 93, of the 92-93 season, but this is like a full season without him. And they didn't bring in anyone really to, or I don't know, was that the year they brought in Michael McKean? This is the McKean Garofalo.
They brought him in that March, the Helen Hunt episode. That was, that was 93 to 94 in the winter.
Oh, right. I get those years confused. Yeah. This is after 94, 95, and they'd already brought in the Janine year and all that.
Yeah. That was the 94 to 95 was Janine Keitliner.
Right. So it was already a year since we'd lost Handy and me and Xander and the Turners. But, again, it's like I tried to emphasize that to him, that, this was not about some kind of culture that needed to be torn down. And, it's not about the Lornettes or whatever, whatever quirks about the show that he wanted to highlight as problematic. It wasn't, because nothing had changed in terms of the institutional running of the show from 92 to 93 to 93 to 95. Nothing. It was the same thing. The only difference was, the show's always going to be as good or as bad as it is because of that core, the writers and the performers, and you got to have the right mix of both. And they didn't.
Yeah, they didn't gel 94 to 95 and 93, 94.
And that's all it was. It was a bad mix. It would have worked itself out, but, so yes, it was absolutely a hit piece because reasonable people, I'm sure he talked to Downey about this, and I emphasized it. I said, hey man, the Chicago Bulls won 3 championships, and then Horace Grant left, and they couldn't get past, and even when Michael Jordan came back, they couldn't get past, they couldn't even get to the finals. You just need one major piece to go, and you're going to need to replace it. And, but, so I feel like, yeah, he definitely had an agenda, and And so I was frustrated by the piece.
People internally were so upset. I talked to one producer and he's like, there's things that aren't true. The one thing I know is not true is they talked about Ellen Cleghorn in the premiere that was Steve Martin Clapton. She had one role as a prostitute, which she was in Bye-Bye. The only time they did Bye-Bye. So there were definitely things in that article that weren't accurate. But I was told the show still has issues with that article, and they are just wary of journalists up to this day. I mean, it did have a big impact on the show.
Because that guy was embedded into the show. He, earned the trust of all these people, hung out, laughed with everybody, and then painted this picture that came from a very specific agenda. And
I could go through that year. There were good sketches. Sandler's Hanukkah song, which...
Of course there were good sketches every year.
The Japanese game show, Andy Breckman's Japanese game show with Alec Baldwin.
I could point out good sketches when the Gene Dumanian year. The show's always going to be up and down. It's just a question of the percentage of up against down, and also what stands out. And I always say this when I talk about the first few months of Conan, people remember the stuff that really tanks because there's so much mediocrity on television. There's a little bit of great stuff, and a lot of mediocrity, and then there's some real and so you remember the great and you remember the shit. And if a show, Conan, we would have some complete train wrecks every now and then, those first few months. We also created a bunch of sketches that ended up being staples of the show for 15 years. But there were a couple of train wrecks, and people remember that stuff.
I will say this. At Saturday Night Live during those 2 years, they weren't letting standbys in almost ever, which now they let 75 or 80 in for live. And that's why sketches don't bomb anymore. And I think if that would have been the case back,
I didn't know that was the case. They let that many standbys into the live show.
Oh yeah, because they're so careful about the audience. That is the biggest difference with the audience is why sketches don't bomb is because the standbys, and also at the top of the cold open, which never happened with you. They hit the applause sign right at the top of the cold open to get that energy from the audience. I'm telling you, it's so simple, but those two things. I mean, when did sketches bomb?
Well, I mean, I totally agree about the standby thing because we always were frustrated that a lot of times the air audience was worse than the dress audience.
They were all VIPs sometimes, almost all, and it ruined shows.
Yeah, there was a lot of VIPs, a very jaded kind of thing going. So that's nice to hear, although sometimes I think the audience just like screaming nowadays.
I know we have to go, so I want to ask you two things. First of all, Leo on Netflix made my wife cry. We were laughing and she just, lost it. It was, and to get you guys such a good score on Rotten Tomatoes for a comedy. It was comedy plus a lot of, there was drama. You totally scored.
I was very happy with, especially the 91% audience Rotten Tomatoes.
So this is Robert Smigel, who just gave you a beautiful introduction to the WGA Awards.
And the guy who, the first guy in whose professional writer's room I saw all this happening.
Yeah, cool. At Dana Carvey show? Was that
Carvey,
the first?
Yeah,
cool.
Yeah, I'd worked before that in comedy for years, but had never been in a room like that.
Cool, yeah.
Because it was all it was like Bob Odenkirk and Dino Stamatopoulos and Mike Stoyanov and myself and Robert and Louis C.K. and Dana Carvey and Charlie Kaufman and Robert Carlock, and then for a while Steve O'Donnell was in there and Spike Feresten, and this was super, super heavy hitters.
Yeah.
Heather Morgan, and I just couldn't believe I was lucky enough to be in that room.